Have you ever experienced something so deeply terrifying that your brain desperately tries to convince you it was just a nightmare, but your very bones, remember the absolute truth? They tell you that monsters aren't real. When you are a child, your parents tuck you in, kiss your forehead, and promise you that the jagged shadows dancing across your bedroom wall are just the branches of the old oak tree outside. They tell you that the creaking floorboards are just the house settling. They tell you that you are safe. But sometimes they are wrong. Sometimes the things in the dark are real. I am 32 years old now, but whenever the temperature drops unexpectedly, I am violently pulled back to a single, horrific night. I was just 7, maybe 8 years old. We lived in a 2-story colonial house at the end of a quiet, dimly lit cul-de-sac. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor, located at the very end of a long, narrow hallway. My parents slept in the master bedroom on the exact opposite side of that hall. To a 7-year-old boy in the pitch black, that 20-foot stretch of carpet might as well have been 100 miles. It was a Tuesday in early October. There was no raging thunderstorm to set a spooky mood, no howling wind to mask the sounds of the night. It was just a quiet, dead-still autumn evening. I had fallen asleep clutching a plastic action figure wrapped tightly in my favorite superhero blanket. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake. It wasn't a slow transition from sleep to wakefulness. My eyes snapped open, my heart instantly hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I lay there in the absolute dark, confused, trying to figure out what had pulled me from my dreams. Then, it happened again. Bang! 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 The sound was deafening. It was a heavy, violent, open-palmed pounding coming directly from my bedroom window. The glass rattled violently in its wooden frame. My breath caught in my throat. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor. There was no balcony. There was no tree branch close enough to strike the glass. Whatever or whoever was hitting the window had to be suspended in mid-air, 20 feet above the backyard grass. I squeezed my eyes shut, paralyzed by the sudden rush of adrenaline. It's just a bird, my frantic 7-year-old brain tried to rationalize. Just a really big bird that hit the window. Silence descended over the room again. A heavy, suffocating silence. The ringing in my ears faded, and I slowly opened my eyes, staring at the ceiling. I was just beginning to convince myself that I had imagined the sheer force of the sound when the atmosphere in the room completely changed. It happened in a matter of seconds. The ambient, comfortable warmth of the house vanished, sucked out of the room as if someone had opened a massive freezer door. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that it felt like an icy physical wave crashing over my small body. The cold bit into my cheeks and nose. It seeped through my thick blanket, chilling my skin into goosebumps. I took a trembling breath, and my eyes widened in sheer terror. In the faint ambient light filtering through the window panes, I could see my own breath. Little white clouds of vapor plumed into the air with every terrified exhale. It had to be below freezing in my bedroom, but the rest of the house was entirely silent. The heater wasn't broken. The cold was isolated entirely to my space. My teeth began to chatter, a tiny clicking sound that sounded as loud as a drum in the dead of night. I clamped
my jaw shut, biting my lip hard enough to taste copper, desperate to remain absolutely quiet. Then came the sound that has haunted every sleepless night I've had for the last 2 decades. Scuff. Pad. Creak. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps.
Someone or something was walking on the hardwood floor right next to my bed. The steps were slow, methodical, almost hesitant. They didn't sound like the heavy, booted footsteps of a burglar. They sounded like bare feet dragging slightly against the wood. Scuff. Pad. The footsteps began to move. I lay rigid, completely buried beneath my blanket, with only my eyes and nose exposed to the freezing air. I tracked the sound with my ears. The invisible entity walked from the foot of my bed, slowly rounding the corner, moving up the right side. It was pacing. It was circling my mattress. "Please go away!" I screamed in my head, tears welling up in my eyes and instantly turning cold on my cheeks. "Please, Mom. Please, Dad. Wake up!" But no one came. There was only the dreadful, rhythmic dragging of those unseen feet. They circled the bed once, then twice. The invisible weight pressed down on the floorboards, making them groan in a way I had never heard before. The entity stopped right beside my head. I stopped breathing entirely. My lungs burned, begging for oxygen, but I refused to take a breath. I knew with absolute certainty that if I turned my head to the left, I would be staring directly into the face of something that did not belong in the world of the living. The air around me felt thick, charged with an oppressive, miserable energy. It felt like standing next to a black hole of pure sorrow. I couldn't take it anymore. The primal instinct of fight or flight finally overrode my paralysis. I chose flight. I knew I had to make it to my parents' room. I mentally mapped out the route. Throw the blanket off, swing my legs over the right side of the bed, away from where the entity was standing. Sprint to the door, rip it open, and run down the hallway. 1, I counted in my head. 2, 3. I violently kicked my blankets away and threw my body toward the opposite edge of the mattress. My bare feet hit the freezing hardwood floor. I pushed off, preparing to launch myself toward the door. But as I moved, a presence suddenly materialized right beside my ear. It closed the distance instantly. There was no sound of movement. It was just suddenly there, invading my personal space. The air against the side of my face was so cold it burned. And then it spoke. It wasn't a demonic roar. It wasn't a menacing growl or an angry shout. It was something infinitely worse. It was a whisper. The voice was raspy, hollow, and dripping with an ancient, agonizing sadness. It sounded like a man who had been crying for 1,000 years. The breath that carried the words brushed against my earlobe, smelling faintly of damp earth and stale, freezing air. I'm lost. The sheer, overwhelming despair in those 2 words broke something inside my brain. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My vocal cords were frozen solid. I bolted. I slammed into my bedroom door, fumbled with the cold brass knob, and threw it open. I scrambled down the dark hallway, my feet slipping on the carpet. I didn't look back. I knew that if I looked back, I would see whatever it was that owned that heartbreaking, terrifying voice standing in my doorway. I hit my parents' bedroom door with my shoulder, pushing it open. The room was dark, the rhythmic sound of my father's deep breathing filling the space. In my state of absolute panic, my mind played a trick on me. I thought that if I woke them up, if I made a sound, the thing in the hallway would hear me. It would know exactly where I was. So, instead of jumping into their bed and shaking them awake, I dropped to my hands and knees. I crawled as fast as I could and wedged myself underneath my parents' heavy oak bed frame. I curled into the tightest ball possible, pressing my back against the wall, surrounded by dust bunnies and forgotten storage boxes. I lay there in the dark, my hands clamped tightly over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut until I saw stars. I waited for the heavy breathing of the entity. I waited for the dragging footsteps to enter the room. I waited for a pale, freezing hand to reach under the bed and drag me out into the dark. Hours bled into one another. I didn't sleep a single wink. I lay there, trapped in a silent agony of anticipation, listening to the springs creak every time my parents shifted above me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the dark blue hues of dawn began to creep through the window blinds. The birds outside began to chirp. The oppressive, freezing weight that had suffocated the house slowly lifted. Around 6:30 a.m., an alarm clock buzzed. I heard my mother groan, followed by the soft thud of her feet hitting the floor. She walked past the bed, stopped, and bent down. The blankets lifted, and her confused face peered under the bed frame. "Daniel?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. "Honey, what on earth are you doing under there? You're covered in dust." I crawled out, my entire body stiff and trembling. I burst into tears the second my mother wrapped her arms around me. I tried to explain it to them over breakfast. I told them about the loud banging on the second-story window. I told them about the freezing cold, the pacing footsteps, and the agonizing whisper right in my ear. My father gave me a sympathetic smile and ruffled my hair. "It was just a nightmare, buddy," he said gently, pouring a cup of coffee. "You probably kicked your blankets off in your sleep and got cold. And the house always makes settling noises at night. There's nothing to be afraid of." My mother agreed, suggesting I had just been sleepwalking. They rationalized it away perfectly. To them, it was just a textbook childhood night terror. They didn't believe me. But I know the truth. I know that dreams don't lower the temperature of a room until you can see your own breath. I know that nightmares don't physically rattle the glass of a window. And I know with chilling certainty that the sheer, profound sadness in that disembodied voice was entirely real. To this day, I sleep with a fan on to drown out the silence. I double-check the locks on my windows, even though I live on the 3rd floor of an apartment building. And whenever the air in my bedroom inexplicably turns cold, I pull the blankets tightly around my neck, close my eyes, and pray that whoever, or whatever, was wandering through my childhood home all those years ago has finally found its way. Because if it hasn't, I know it is still out there in the dark, wandering and looking for someone to listen. My father gave me a sympathetic smile and
ruffled my hair. "It was just a nightmare, buddy," he said gently, pouring a cup of coffee. "You probably kicked your blankets off in your sleep and got cold. And the house always makes settling noises at night. There's nothing to be afraid of." My mother agreed, suggesting I had just been sleepwalking.
They rationalized it away perfectly. To them, it was just a textbook childhood night terror. They didn't believe me, and over the years, I tried my hardest to adopt their reality. I tried to convince myself that they were right. I am 32 years old now. I live alone in a modern, newly built apartment complex on the 6th floor. There are no drafty windows here. There are no old, groaning oak floorboards. The thermostat is strictly set to a comfortable 72 degrees, and the building is practically soundproof. I have spent a lifetime building a safe, perfectly controlled environment where the things in the dark cannot reach me. But last night, I woke up at 2 a.m. There was no sudden banging on the glass. There was no jarring noise to pull me from my sleep. I simply woke up with that heavy, primal instinct that tells you someone is watching you. I lay there in the quiet hum of my modern apartment, staring up at the ceiling. I told myself it was just stress. I told myself it was just the remnants of a bad dream. I took a deep breath to calm my racing heart. But as I exhaled, my blood ran completely cold. In the faint ambient glow of the street lamps outside, I watched a tiny white cloud of vapor plume upward from my lips. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just lay there, paralyzed beneath my heavy duvet, watching my breath crystallize in the freezing air of my bedroom. The temperature was dropping by the second. The silence of the apartment suddenly felt terribly, overwhelmingly oppressive. And then, from the foot of my bed, barely audible over the hammering of my own pulse, I heard it. Scuff. Pad. I have tightly closed my eyes. It has been 4 hours and the dawn is still so far away. I haven't moved a single muscle. I am too terrified to look, and I am too terrified to run. Because the dragging footsteps have stopped right next to my pillow. The air against my left ear is burning with an unnatural, freezing cold. I am just lying here in the dark, waiting. Waiting to find out if it's still lost, or if, after 25 years, it has finally found me.